In this video, we're going to take a look at 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 8 through verse 10. This kind of section about what's taking place within the early Christian communities being addressed by 1 Timothy. I'll read the verses first, and then we'll kind of take a look here at each line. Author writes, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Also, that the women should dress themselves in moderate clothing with reverence and self-control, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. All right, stop there and take a look first. I want to talk a little bit here about how we sometimes use this passage, and we want to see how these passages relate to the way in which we carry out Christian worship today. And so what we're doing is we're kind of, quote, translating the instructions that are here in 1 Timothy 2 and seeking somehow or another to understand its relevance for what it is that is taking place in our Christian assemblies today. So I would just point out a couple of things here that James Thompson, who has written a small commentary on the pastoral epistles, and according to Thompson, there are three reasons why it's difficult to translate first century Christian worship formats, if we really even knew that, to our own time. He says, first of all, we have no really order of worship from the first century. Okay, so nowhere in the letters or in Acts is there a kind of sense of, all right, this is what you do, first, second, third, we don't have an order of worship. So we don't know what a first century Christian assembly structure looked like in terms of an order. Secondly, their assemblies were very different than our assemblies today. So most assemblies of Christians in the first century, as those that are being imagined here for the background for 1 Timothy, they're going to be taking place in homes. They're not going to be taking place in a building that's specifically structured for a Christian use. So, and these assemblies here are probably much more diverse in terms of what is taking place than usually what is taking place in assemblies today. So most assemblies, there is a desire for some kind of formality of structure, but I'm not sure that that's simply the case there. Plus, the other thing is that they're meeting in homes, and especially if you're thinking about homes that are located within a city, like in Ephesus. Well, homes, back then are not in order for ventilation. You're going to have open windows, you're going to have open doors. People are going to be able to walk by, they're going to be able to see or hear what is going on, as opposed to church buildings today where people have closed doors and passerbys don't know what generally is taking place inside those assemblies. So they look quite different than what we've got today. And so because of that, they lack really kind of privacy. So those open doors, open windows allow people to see what is going on and make judgments about what is taking place. And so the kind of activity that Christians are engaged in are much more readily accessible to the non-Christian observer. So because of that, we got to keep in mind that you can't just simply try to lift some expressions out of a biblical text and then say there's a one-to-one correlation to something that could take place in our assemblies today. It's just because of what they're having to deal with is not what oftentimes we have to deal with. So the reason why we're talking about worship, it has to do with the expression that is used there in verse 8. Now, depending upon the translations that you have available, some may say, I desire that in everywhere. Other translations are going to have the phrase in every place. Now, that might seem like not much of a difference, but there's actually is quite a bit of difference here in how different translators are understanding the expression. So what is being used here is the Greek word topos. And the word topos, which can be translated as place, actually has a technical reference as a place of worship. And so that's why we're kind of talking about translating first century worship into contemporary worship activities. So I don't agree then with the translation in everywhere. I don't think he's talking about everywhere, men should pray, lifting up holy hands. I think he has in mind the times when people are coming together in order to worship. And the same thing about with women. Well, what's taking place, what's occurring, as it were, in the assemblies. In the Septuagint and Philo, we can see the use of topos for the holy place of worship, that is the temple. You can also see this in John 11:48. In the Qumran community, they used their word for place or to refer to the gathering of 10 men to form a basic unit of the sect itself. We also see in Josephus that Josephus used the word topos when he's referring to Jewish synagogues. And we even see that Paul used topos when referring to Christian gatherings for worship. 1 Corinthians 1 and 1 Thessalonians 1. So, we're going to see this idea of topos as that technical, as this reference for an assembly. And so I think that's what's going on here as well. There we even have synagogue inscriptions that exist that show Jews used place to refer to their places of worship. So there's ample evidence, I think, in order to justify the decision. That's what is thought as here. Now, what's really kind of interesting here, we've got this in worship, then the men should be lifting up holy hands. So this kind of expression of holy hands is picking up this idea of not having been engaged, as it were, in using one's hands symbolically or using one's life in things that have that would be in disobedience to God, holy hands, then lifting them up, showing God, as it were, that you have clean hands. You've not violated God's principles in terms of what you have done to others, and especially this idea of anger or argument. So that may be a reference to how some of the false teachers think should be taking place or occurring in the assemblies, where they are wanting to argue ideas or bring about ideas, and seeing the occasion of the assembly as a place to debate. And that's not what Paul thinks the activities of the assemblies is focused on. It's focused on lifting up faith, not in order to have these arguments and controversies over words and over stories. And so what's happening then in the assemblies is this argument that is going on. Of course, going back to what was said earlier, if people are walking by and seeing this kind of group meeting, what's going on in there, who are these people, and they are arguing with each other, that gives the impression about a Christian assembly that Paul would think is inaccurate. This is not what the Christian assembly should be reflecting to non-believers. But then it becomes the question about how does this language about men praying, instruction about men praying, how does that relate then to women and dress? How do we connect these two verses together? So how are the two thoughts? Well, in one place we've got the idea of I want, therefore, because the therefore is indicating something about the desire of God for all people to be saved, that Jesus gave himself up as a ransom for all. So if that is the case, then he wants the men in the assembly, he's thinking about, to pray. And he's got these instructions. He wants them to pray in every place, in other words, in every assembly. He wants them to pray lifting up holy hands, and he wants them to pray without anger and disputing. Now with women, we've got the likewise that is used here. So likewise, or also women in proper adornment with modesty and decency to dress themselves. So we've got to pray and we have to dress themselves. So how is the connection between the praying and the dressing themselves linked together? That's the question we're posing here. This is all connected with the word that oftentimes is rendered with something like likewise. It might work as a general transition. So Paul is moving from instructing men on prayer to instructing women on dress. And I think that's probably how a number of people, when they're reading this verse, these verses, might take it. We're just jumping from a subject of prayer to a completely different subject, which has to do with dress. And this parallels the structure that we see in Titus 2, 1 through 5. So in Titus 2, if we just very briefly here go to Titus 2, verses 1 through 5, we've got these kind of instructions that are being given to different people. So he's got instructions to older men, instructions then to older women. And so it's just a simple transition from what I want to tell men to what I want to tell women. And it forms something of a complete thought. Here are my instructions about prayer, how men pray, and here's my instructions about women and how they should dress. So these are the arguments for why taking it as a general transition would make sense. I also want to consider that it might work as a comparative transition. So what Paul is doing is he's moving from instructing men to pray with holy hands to instruct women to pray in proper dress. Likewise, I want women to pray being dressed in the sense of whatever this instructions are here about dress. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But the dress is connected here. The topic about dress is because when women are coming in and they are performing, as it were, an act within the assembly. So some may respond back, well, it wouldn't make any difference to Paul whether they were coming to dress for and thinking that they were praying, or they were just coming to dress and coming to the assembly at all, which is a good argument rebuttal. But in this way, it's also cohesive because it's now centered around the one concept of prayer, not two concepts of prayer and dress. And secondly, it's consistent as well with 1 Corinthians 11:5, where there Paul is also talking about women having the appropriate dress, and this particular with the veil. So this kind of concern about when women pray, do they have the appropriate dress for offering up their prayers? And so some may point to that as another kind of justification for wanting to read it as a comparative transition. So two different possibilities, and so that have been put forward by different scholars of how to read that transition. So worthwhile just to consider that and what we think Paul might have in mind. All right, I'm going to end here by just focusing on the dress itself and what's wrong with the clothes that's being laid out here, and moderate clothing with reverence and self-control. So they were seemingly viewed as ostentatious. And sometimes women are characterized as wearing clothing that are seductive and possibly even indicating domestic insubordination. So, in other words, there's something about this dress that may indicate that the women see themselves somehow or another free from the responsibilities or the obligations that may be placed upon them by the husband. In other words, the husband don't want you dressed like that going out in the public where other men would see you, and they're going to show their freedom, as it were, from their husband's um, wishes or desires, and so this seems to be one of the ways in which to read these instructions. For Paul, the true adornment then is internal and expresses itself outwardly in Christian conduct. So, good works, what's proper for women who profess reverence for God. And so, this focus here is that something about the dress that is coming in does not look very reverent, whether women are engaged in prayer, which would think would be the reverent activity that is done for the benefit of the community, or if they're just showing up at the assemblies in ways for their purposes of worship, and it's not irreverent in terms of how they're dressed. The concept here of, professing reverence for God, this whole idea about self-reverence and self-control. So, eidos, self-respect, was considered by Hellenistic writers to be a feminine virtue and self-control. So what we're really seeing here, as well as there are some virtues that would have been common in Hellenistic society, that the author here is just continuing to perpetuate. This is the way in which, in our culture, in our world, how women are dressing. These are the type of women they, in society, value, just like you would have things about men and what kind of cultural appropriate behaviors for men would be expected. And so that's what he seems to be stressing with these particular words. So I'll leave the women's dress issue. So that's generally what he's kind of got in mind. And so we'll pick up then from 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 through 15 later on.